In a small office at Wilton Park in Buckinghamshire sometime in the summer of 1945, a captured German field marshal answered a question put to him by a British interrogator. The man was Ger von Rundstedt. He was 69 years old, recovering from a heart attack he had suffered during his initial questioning, and he had been a soldier in 3 different German armies for more than 50 years. The interrogator wanted his honest assessment of the Atlantic Wall, the vast belt of concrete fortifications Rundstedt had been responsible for from his headquarters at Saint-Jean-en-Laye outside Paris. Rundstedt did not hedge the wall, he said, had been a gigantic bluff from the Scheldt estuary down to the Seine. It had real strength. Below that into Brittany and toward the Spanish border was, in his words, a dreary situation with really nothing at all. To look at it for yourself in Normandy, he said, was to see what rubbish it had been. And then he said something stranger. He said that the enemy had probably known more about the wall than the men who built it. He said it without anger. He had nothing to gain by saying it, and he was not the kind of man who flattered his captives. He was simply describing what he had concluded by the spring of 1944, more than a year before the war ended. The men trying to break his wall could see it more clearly than the men holding it. That should not have been possible. The Atlantic Wall was the largest defensive construction project of the 20th century. Built by the most security-conscious regime in Europe, defended by the Wehrmacht and patrolled by the Gestapo. 17 million cub-m of concrete had gone into it. 1.22 million tons of steel. Hundreds of thousands of workers, mostly French civilians and forced laborers under the organization TOT, had spent 4 years pouring it into place. And yet by the morning of June 6, 1944, the lieutenants and sergeants coming ashore at Wavre and Colleville and La Riviere had maps in their pockets that showed German positions their German occupants did not know had been logged. They had the spacing of beach obstacles down to the foot. They had the type and field of fire of bunkers no Allied soldier had ever seen. They knew which minefields were real and which were dummies. How a wall stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees came to be better understood by its enemies than by its garrison is a story that has never been told the way Rundstedt himself told it. It runs from a cane house painter on a stepladder to a submarine off Omaha Beach to a manor house in Buckinghamshire, where the men who lost the war were quietly being recorded by men who had won it. The interesting question is not how the Allies learned what they learned. It is why the Germans, having built the thing, never quite managed to see it themselves. To understand what Rundstedt had inherited when he was reappointed Commander-in-Chief West in March 1942, you have to understand a quarrel that had been running inside the German General Staff for more than 100 years. It was a quarrel about walls. The German army had a long memory about fortified lines. It remembered the chain of fortresses along the Rhine that had failed against Napoleon. It remembered more recently the catastrophic collapse of the French Maginot Line in 1940, when the heaviest concentration of fixed-gun emplacements in Europe had simply been bypassed through the Ardennes forest while the gunners sat in their casemates with nothing to shoot at. The lesson the German staff had drawn from these episodes going back to the writings of Helmuth von Moltke the Elder in the 1860s was straightforward. Fixed defenses were a trap. They concentrated resources. They told the attacker exactly where to come and exactly where not to come, and they almost never held against a serious enemy with the freedom to maneuver around them. Rundstedt had absorbed that lesson all his life. He had grown up in a Prussian military family, entered the army in 1892 and risen through the staff system that had produced Schlieffen and Hindenburg before him. By the time Hitler came to power in 1933, he was already a senior general with strong views, and his views on coastal fortification were the orthodox views of his generation. You did not stop a serious invasion at a wall. You stopped it in open ground with mobile reserves and armor in the period after the enemy had committed himself and before he had consolidated his beachhead. This was the doctrine. It had worked in 2 world wars. And in March 1942, when Hitler issued Führer Directive 40 and ordered the construction of an unbroken defensive line from northern Norway to the Bay of Biscay, Rundstedt knew the doctrine was being violated. He could do little about it. Hitler had personally signed the directive. The directive itself reveals what the wall was meant to be. It spoke of denying the enemy access to the European coast and of safeguarding the sea entrances to protected waterways. It did not speak of defeating an invasion. The job of the wall in its original conception was to slow an enemy down, not to stop him. That was the part Joseph Goebbels, and the propaganda ministry began to forget almost immediately. By the spring of 1943, German newsreels were showing audiences at home staged shots of huge gun emplacements in Norway and the Pasdakalala, manned by helmeted soldiers who knew they were being filmed. The voiceover spoke of an iron ring around what the propagandists were calling Festung Europa, the fortress of Europe that no enemy could ever break. The reality from where Rundstedt sat outside Paris was something else. The wall was uneven. The Pasdakalala sector, where the channel was narrowest, and where every German staff officer expected the invasion to come, was genuinely formidable. Other stretches were almost ornamental. The infantry holding the wall was a strange composite of older Germans recovering wounded teenagers and what the Wehrmacht called Osttroppen Eastern troops. These were Soviet prisoners of war, mostly Cossacks, Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, and Turkmens who had been recruited or pressed into German uniform and shipped west to stand on the French coast pointing rifles at an ocean. By the end of 1943, 2 OT battalions on average were attached to almost every German coastal division. Their German officers did not entirely trust them. The men themselves often did not share a common language with the squad next to them. In late October 1943, after weeks of personal inspection along the coast, Rundstedt sat down and wrote a long, blunt memorandum that he sent through Field Marshal Wilhelm Kittel to Hitler himself. He described the Atlantic Wall as useful for propaganda and useful for delaying an invader briefly, but argued that by itself it could not defeat an invasion. The only hope of a successful defense in the West, he wrote, lay in mobile armored reserves held inland, ready to counterattack the moment the enemy committed himself to a beach. Rundstedt was making the same argument the German General Staff had been making for a century against the temptation of fixed defenses. Hitler read the report. Hitler told Rundstedt he agreed with him, and then Hitler did the opposite. On November 3, 1943, he issued Führer Directive 51 and named Field Marshal Win Rammel General Inspector of the Western Defenses, reporting not to Rund, but directly to the High Command in Berlin. RML arrived in France around November 10 and spent the winter inspecting. By mid-January 1944, he had assumed command of Army Group B, which controlled the Channel coast itself. RML's conclusions were the opposite of Rundstedt's. He had spent 18 months in North Africa under Allied air power, and he believed armored reserves could not be moved during daylight without being destroyed from the air. The invasion, RML said, had to be stopped on the beach itself in the first 24 hours, or it would not be stopped at all. Hitler told RML he agreed to. The result was a German command in the West that by the spring of 1944 had 2 field marshals working at cross purposes, neither of whom fully controlled the troops he was supposed to command, both of whom were second-guessed personally by Hitler on questions as small as where to position individual armored divisions. Rundstedt on paper was Commander-in-Chief West. In practice, he had no authority over the Navy in his sector where Admiral Theodor Kranker ran the coastal Kriegsmarine. He had no authority over the Luftwaffe in his sector where Field Marshal Hugo Spur ran Luftflotte 3. The Waffen-SS units in his theater answered to Heinrich Himmler. The organization taught which actually built the wall answered to Albert Speer. The OKW Reserve Panzer Divisions, the only mobile striking force capable of throwing an invasion back into the sea, could not be released without Hitler's personal authorization. Rundstedt sometimes told visitors with the dry humor of an old man with nothing left to lose that the only person he was certain he commanded was the sentry at the front gate of his headquarters. While the German command in the West was tying itself in knots, the men who would attack the wall were doing something else. They were taking it apart on paper. The first part of that effort had begun in a place no German officer would have thought to watch. In March 1942, the British Broadcasting Corporation, working with the Combined Operations Headquarters in London, made an appeal over the air to the citizens of the United Kingdom. The appeal asked for one strange thing. It asked for old holiday photographs and postcards of the European coast, anything between Norway and the Pyrenees, anything from before the war. The British public sent in millions of pictures and cards. They came in shoe boxes and brown paper parcels tied with string with handwritten notes attached. A photograph of a couple on the sand at Luxor in 1937. A postcard of the harbor at Westrium. A snapshot of children eating ice cream on the seafront at Vierville. The intelligence officers sorted them by location and cross-referenced them with French maps. They built up picture by picture an image of every beach the Germans were about to fortify. They could measure the slope of the sand. They could see how high the seawall was. They could see where the access roads came down and where the shingle banks rose. In some cases, they had a postcard taken from the same angle at which a German propaganda film unit later photographed a new bunker. And they could measure how the bunker had altered the original view. It was in its way the largest piece of crowdsourced intelligence collection in the history of war up to that date. It cost almost nothing. The Germans never knew it had happened. While the postcards were arriving in London, a far more dangerous form of reconnaissance was beginning on the other side of the channel. In the summer of 1940, days after France fell, Charles de Gaulle in London had appointed a young officer named André Douavin, who used the cover name Colonel Pacey to build from nothing a free French intelligence service. Davin had no agents, no budget, and almost no equipment. What he had was a single conviction. He believed the Allies would eventually return to France, and that when they did, they would need to know what was waiting for them on the coast. Out of his small London office, the work of producing that knowledge was farmed out to a network of ordinary people in occupied France. The intelligence service that became responsible for the Atlantic Wall was called Century. It was the intelligence arm of a larger resistance movement called the Organisation Civile at Military, founded in spring of 1942. Century's product was routed back to London through Colonel Remy's older network, the Confer, which had the wireless and courier connections to get it across the channel. The head of Century's section in Normandy was a man named Marcel Girard. The kind group under him was about 40 people. They were not soldiers. They were sailors and fishermen, postmen and school teachers, a Catholic priest in one village, the wife of a hotel keeper in another. They counted German trucks. They noted the changing of the guard at gun emplacements. They walked past construction sites on the way to work and counted the rebar coming off the rise. They sketched what they saw at night on the backs of newspapers and passed the sketches up the chain by hand, by rail, by fishing boat. There is one episode inside the Century network that on its own could fill an evening. It involves a member of the same group named René Duchess. Duchess was a house painter and decorator, a small, cheerful man in his late 30s with a habit of clowning that German officers found amusing and dismissed. On May 7, 1942, his luck and his nerve combined in a way that has never been quite duplicated in the entire history of resistance work. He had taken a contract to repaint the interior offices of the Organisation Top Branch in Caen, the German agency in charge of construction along the lower Normandy coast. While he was on a step-ladder pretending to compare wallpaper samples, an officer left the room. On the desk was a rolled-up document. Duchess stepped down. He looked. The document was a master plan of the Atlantic Wall fortifications for the entire Cotentin sector, marked with the position of every casemate, every bunker shelter, every underwater obstacle, every minefield, and every dummy minefield meant to deceive an attacker into wasting his engineers. He took it. He hid it behind a mirror in the same office and walked out. Days later, he came back on the pretext of finishing the job and recovered it. The plan was carried across France, packed with other documents and smuggled across the channel by Colonel Remy himself in a small fishing boat called Le Douane. Arriving in London on June 21, 1942, Remy walked into the offices of British intelligence and laid the documents on a desk. The officers who opened them were so stunned by what they saw that their first concern was that the Germans, when they discovered the theft, would change the entire defensive plan. The decision was made to copy the plan and tell no one outside the smallest possible circle. The Germans never knew it was gone. Over the next 2 years, the Sun group of Century alone reportedly sent more than 3,000 individual documents to London. All of them dealt with the Atlantic Wall. Across France, the wider network grew to thousands of agents. The cost was terrible. Both Century and the Confrérie Notre Dame suffered very heavy Gestapo penetration. Large sections of both networks were arrested, shot, or deported. Duchess's wife, Odette, was arrested in November 1943 and deported to Ravensbrück the following spring. She survived, returned to France after the war, and lived until March 2005 in her own bed, having outlived nearly everyone who had ever known what she had done. While the French resistance was filling in the wall from the inside, The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces were photographing it from above. Reconnaissance Spitfires, stripped of guns and armor to gain altitude and speed, flew north to south along the coast at heights the German fighters could not reach. The film came back to a converted manor house at Medmenham in Buckinghamshire, the central interpretation unit of Allied photographic intelligence. By 1944, the station was running well over 1,500 personnel. Roughly 600 of them were trained photographic interpreters, more than half of them women. They worked under stereoscopic viewers in pairs around the clock. They could distinguish a real bunker from a wooden decoy by the shadow it cast at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They could tell a freshly poured concrete casemate from one that had been there for 6 months by the color of the disturbed earth around it. By the spring of 1944, they had identified, located, and classified thousands of individual emplacements, gun pits, beach obstacles, radar stations, and field positions along the coast. In the final months before the invasion, the most dangerous reconnaissance of all began. Late in 1943, a young Royal Engineers officer named Logan Scott Bowden, attached to a small unit called the Combined Operations Pilotage Parties, suggested that someone needed to swim ashore at the proposed invasion beaches and bring back samples of the actual sand. The reason was an engineering question. The planners needed to know whether the beaches would carry the weight of a 30-ton Sherman tank coming off a landing craft, or whether the tanks would simply sink into clay or peat and become stationary targets for German guns. Aerial photographs could not answer that question. There was no other way to find out for certain. On the night of December 31st, 1943, Scott Bowden and a Royal Marine sergeant named Bruce Ogden Smith carried out the first such reconnaissance, swimming ashore in Operation KJH at what would become the eastern end of Gold Beach near Vere. They returned with their samples. Then on the night of January 17th, 1944, they went back. This time they went in a far more dangerous way. They were carried across the channel in a submarine X-20, a vessel only 51 feet long, crewed for the operation by 5 men crammed into a hull about the size of a small bus. The skipper was Lieutenant Ken Hudsmith. With him was Sub-Lieutenant Bruce Enza, the COP commander, Lieutenant Commander Nigel Clockstone Wilmot, and the 2 swimmers, Scott Bowen and Ogden Smith. The X-20 took them within 400 yards of what would later be called Omaha Beach. Scott Bowden and Ogden Smith pulled swimming suits over their woolen underwear and slipped into the water. They moved on hands and knees in the dark, scooping samples into rubber tubes labeled by location. At one point, Scott Bowden, lying flat behind the shingle, looked up and saw a single line of footprints ahead of him in the sand, and then a torch beam at the back of the beach. A German sentry was walking the line, less than 200 yards from him. He waited. The sentry moved on. He continued his work. He swam back. The X-20 submerged and went home. The samples came back to England. They were analyzed by soil scientists working with the D-Day planning teams with the crystallographer J. Danel as the senior figure on beach trafficability. The results confirmed that the proposed American beaches would carry the weight of armor. That single piece of information shaped the entire assault plan for what would later be called Omaha. Without the rubber tubes from the X-20, the planners would have had to guess. By the spring of 1944, all of these streams of information were flowing into a single building in St. James's Square in London called Norfolk House, where the topographers and intelligence officers of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force were assembling them into a set of maps unlike any maps that had ever existed. The maps were called Bigot maps after the security classification that controlled them. The classification was above top secret. Only a few thousand people across the entire Allied effort were cleared to see them. The maps themselves looked at first glance like ordinary topographic charts of the Normandy coast with roads, towns, contours, and tide markings printed in the usual colors. But over the base layer, in colored overprint, every piece of intelligence the Allies had gathered was marked in tiny, precise notation. The position, type, and field of fire of every observed German bunker. Anti-tank ditch around strong point. Hedgehogs spaced 30 to 35 feet apart. Probably mined. Drainage ditch. The depth of the water at low tide and at high tide. The location on Omaha Beach alone of more than 200 individual obstacles by category and spacing. The maps were issued in versions and revisions. The way ordnance survey sheets are issued. The surviving Omaha East and Omaha West sheets on which the United States 1st Infantry Division would land in the easy red and fox green sectors below Cauville were drawn at 1 to 25,000 on base sheets 79 and 80 of the British General Staff Geographical Service series. The beach obstacle overprint editions carried updates as late as May 12th and May 30th, 1944, only days before the assault. When a security failure during the practice landing called Operation Tiger off the Devon coast in late April left 10 Bigot-cleared officers missing in the water, Eisenhower personally ordered that all 10 bodies be recovered before the invasion could proceed. He could not risk one of them having been captured alive. The result was that Eisenhower's planning staff had a more accurate picture of the Normandy sector of the wall than the German divisions actually defending it. German engineers received frequent updates about new construction in their own zones. They did not receive systematic comprehensive updates about fields of fire across battalion boundaries or about the dead ground between adjoining bunkers or about precise obstacle spacing in neighboring sectors. The Allies had all of it on a single sheet kept current between the resistance, the photo interpreters, the swimmers, and the topographers. They had built a unified picture of the wall that no German general had ever assembled. That is what Rundstedt would mean when he sat in a British prisoner of war facility in 1945 and said almost matter-of-factly that the enemy had known his wall better than the men who built it. He was not being clever. He was telling a fact he had begun to suspect long before the invasion came. There are anniversaries no one announces and faces no one prints in newspapers. The fishermen who sailed Le Douang across the channel with the same documents. The young resistance women who sketched coastal batteries on the backs of grocery lists. The Medmenham photographic interpreters, mostly women in their 20s, who spent the war in dim huts staring at black and white prints under stereoscopic viewers and signed the Official Secrets Act and never told their families afterward what they had done. None of them are in the textbooks. Most of them never received a medal. If you have read this far, a like on this video keeps the memory of work like that alive a little longer, and I am grateful for it. To understand why the German side of the wall ended up in such a different condition from the Allied side, you have to look at what was happening inside the German command structure during the same months that the Allies were assembling their maps. The Germans were not idle. They were not lazy. They were not individually less competent. They were working inside a system that had begun to break under its own weight. The first problem was Hitler. By 1944, the dictator had taken personal control of operational decisions in the West to a degree that would have been unthinkable in 1940. He decided where individual divisions would be placed. He decided which panzer reserves could be moved without his explicit authorization. He decided on a level of absurd specificity the sequence in which certain coastal batteries would be camouflaged. Field commanders who suggested alternatives were ignored or replaced. Rundstedt, who had been dismissed once already in 1941 after a disagreement on the Russian front, knew that another open clash with Hitler would end his career. So did everyone around him. So men who knew better stopped saying so out loud. The second problem was the absurd fragmentation of authority. Rundstedt commanded the army in the West, but the Channel sector itself was RML's, and RML reported sometimes to Rund and sometimes around him. The Marine answered to Kranker. The Luftwaffe answered to Spurl. The SS answered to Himmler. The Organisation Tatsu answered to Speer. The Reserve Panzers answered to Hitler. There was no officer at any level below the dictator himself who had a unified picture of all the forces along the coast. When General Bodo Zimmermann, the senior operations officer at Rundstedt's headquarters, sat down after the war to write his account for the United States Army's Foreign Military Studies program, he described his commander as gravely concerned from 1942 onward because neither the field forces nor the fortifications in his judgment were adequate. The third problem was who actually manned the wall. RML's inspections in early 1944 found that many static infantry divisions had no transport at all, not even horse-drawn wagons. Their soldiers were a mix of older men, recovering wounded and Ostropin battalions whose loyalty in a crisis was uncertain. The senior non-commissioned officers, the backbone of any infantry unit, had been bled away year after year on the Eastern Front. Their replacements were younger and far less experienced. In Hans von Luck's account of his command at 21st Panzer Division, written years later, The static divisions along the Channel coast were not regarded by their own neighbors as units that could defeat a serious landing. They were there to soak up the first attack, slow it down, and signal the inland reserves. Even the men holding the wall did not believe in it. Now stack those three problems against the Allied effort. The Allies had unified command under Eisenhower. They had inter-service cooperation that had been forced to work painfully since 1942. They had a single intelligence picture, a single set of maps, a single deception plan. They had time, and they had something the Germans had no equivalent of, which was a flood of information from inside the wall itself, smuggled out by men and women who had decided individually that the wall had to fall. While the wall was being mapped, a second Allied operation was underway, designed not to find German positions, but to make Hitler stare at the wrong ones. It was called Operation Bodyguard, and within it, Operation Fortitude South, run from offices in southern England. Fortitude South created on paper an entire fictional army group. The 1st United States Army Group, 11 divisions and 150,000 imaginary men, was supposedly commanded by General George Patton, who at that point was the German Army's most feared American officer. The Phantom Army was given encampments in Kent and Essex. Inflatable rubber tanks were placed in fields where German reconnaissance flights could photograph them. About 250 dummy landing craft, Big Bobs and Wet Bobs, were deployed across southeast English harbors from Folkestone to the Thames and the Suffolk rivers. Constant, deliberately careless radio traffic was generated by signal companies sending messages between units that did not exist. The story being told was the same in every channel. The real invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, the shortest crossing point. Whatever happened anywhere else would be a feint. The Germans believed it. They believed it because they wanted to believe it. Because the Pas de la made tactical sense, and because the source of the most detailed confirmation was a Spanish national named Juan Pule Garcia, named Garbo, who was on the British payroll and was feeding Berlin a steady diet of false reports through 27 imaginary sub-ins he had invented out of his own head. Rundstedt, in meetings with Keitel, cited Garau's reports by name. So did Hitler. The German 15th Army, with as many as 19 divisions, sat in the Pas de Calais sector before, during, and for weeks after the actual landings in Normandy, waiting for an invasion that would never come. When it came on June 6th, the men on the wall in Normandy met an enemy who already knew the ground. The American Rangers at Point du Hoc climbed cliffs at the right place because aerial photographs had been studied for months. The British landings at Sword and Gold went in along corridors that had been mapped by resistance agents and by the swimmers from the X-20 and X-23. Even when the German defense was ferocious, as it was at Omaha, the failures of the assault were tactical rather than strategic. The Allies were not surprised by what they found. They had seen most of it already. Almost a year later, the war in Europe ended. Rundstedt was captured at Bad Tolz in Bavaria on May 1, 1945 by men of the United States 36th Infantry Division under Major General Johnny Dahlquist. He was 69 years old and in poor health, recovering from heart trouble. He suffered a second heart attack during early questioning, and the interrogation was paused. On May 5th, he was brought to the headquarters of the United States 7th Army at Augsburg, where he met Lieutenant General Alexander Patch. Then he was flown to Britain. He was held first at the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center at Wilton Park, a former country estate in Buckinghamshire that British intelligence had quietly converted with hidden microphones in many rooms into a facility designed to debrief captured senior German officers. Many of the generals held there did not realize their conversations were being recorded. They spoke freely with each other in private. The transcripts of those private conversations taken down by British and American officers run to thousands of pages and remain among the most candid things any senior German officer ever said about the war because the men involved believed no one outside the room was listening. Rundstedt was also interviewed at length in formal interrogation sessions and later by military historians, including Basil Liddell Hart, whose own working notes are preserved at the Liddell Hart Center for Military Archives at King's College London. Liddell Hart had received Foreign Office authorization to begin interviewing senior German prisoners at the end of January 1946. Other interrogations were conducted by the Historical Section of Canadian Military Headquarters under Charles Stacey, which produced its own series of special reports on German commanders during 1945 and 1946. The two streams of records, British and Canadian, sometimes overlap and sometimes diverge. Both contain Rundstedt at length on the subject of the Atlantic Wall. In those records, the field marshal said many things. Some of them were self-serving, some were carefully phrased to protect the reputation of the German officer corps. But on the wall itself, in transcript after transcript, he was direct. He used the same handful of phrases over and over in slightly different combinations to different interrogators on different days. Bluff, propaganda, rubbish, defense in depth had been needed and had not been there. And in one form or another, the sentence that anchors this entire investigation. He said the enemy had probably known more about the wall than the men who built it. Why? Why was it that the Allies working from outside with no access to the wall itself could see it more clearly than the Germans who had built it brick by brick? The answer is not technical. It is structural. It comes down to one quiet difference between the two systems. The Allies by 1944 had built an intelligence culture in which information flowed upward and sideways without political distortion. A photograph taken by a Spitfire pilot over Caen on a Tuesday could be interpreted at Medmenham on a Wednesday and incorporated into a Bayet map at Norfolk House on a Thursday. A sketch made by a French resistance fisherman could be in a London office 4 days later. A sand sample lifted from the future Omaha beach in mid-January was being analyzed in a laboratory by the end of the month. The system worked because the people inside it trusted each other to share what they found and trusted their superiors not to punish them for finding bad news. The Germans had no such system. They had brilliant individual officers and superb engineers. They had the organization TOD, which could pour concrete faster than almost any construction agency in the world. What they did not have was a culture that allowed bad news to travel honestly upward. A junior engineer who reported that a sector of the wall was inadequate risked being labeled a defeatist. A staff officer who pointed out that Ostropin battalions could not be relied upon risked being asked why he was undermining morale. By 1944, German officers wrote their honest reports primarily for after the war. They knew that what they put in writing while Hitler was alive could end their careers if it reached the wrong desk. So information about the wall was fragmented inside the German chain. Each sector commander knew his own piece. The TOT knew construction. The Marine knew the gun batteries. The infantry divisions knew the troops manning the trenches. No one above the divisional level had a unified picture because a unified picture would have shown that the wall taken as a whole did not work. The Allies working from outside were under no such pressure. They wanted the truth. They built systems to find it. They found it. There is a particular kind of document in the British and Canadian archives
They had
in
a
the
single
Royal Air
intelligence
Force Museum
picture,
at
a
Hendon
single set
and in
of
the
maps,
Liddell Hart
a
Centre at
single
King's College
deception
London
plan.
that
They had
survives in
time,
faded
and
carbon
they had
copy.
something the
It is
Germans had
paper.
no equivalent
It is an
of,
interrogation
which was a flood of
transcript in which
information
the
from
field
inside the
marshal
wall
is
itself,
asked about
smuggled
Allied
out
air
by
action
men and women
overboard.
who had
His
decided
answers are tired.
individually
He acknowledges
that the
that
wall
German
had to
forces
fall.
were
While the
ill-equipped
wall was
and
being
disorganized
mapped,
on D-Day.
a second Allied
He
operation
acknowledges
was
that the wall
underway,
was a bluff.
designed not
He
to find
acknowledges
German
that the enemy
positions
had
but to
known
make
it.
Hitler
These
stare
are
at the
some of the
wrong
quiet
ones.
documents
It was
of the
called
Second World
Operation
War.
Bodyguard,
They do not
and
appear in the
within it,
newsreels of
Operation
1945.
Fortitude South.
They do not show
Run
up in
from
the standard
offices in
memoirs
southern
that the
England,
German generals
Fortitude
later wrote
South
for
created
sale
on
in West
paper an
Germany
entire
in the
fictional
1950s,
army group,
where the
the
story of
first
the war
United
was
States Army
retold
Group,
with a great
11
deal more
divisions and
dignity. But they are there on
150,000
file.
imaginary
They are
men,
what the
was
men
supposedly
actually said
commanded
when the
by
camera
General
was
George
off.
Patton,
There is a
who at
final
that
answer to
point
the
was the
question
German
that
Army's
opened
most
all of
feared
this.
American
How does
officer.
a wall
The
that
Phantom
runs from
Army
the
was given
Arctic Circle to
encampments
the
in
Pyrenees,
Kent and Essex.
manned by hundreds of
Inflatable
thousands
rubber
of men,
tanks were
end up
placed in
better
fields where
understood by
German
its
reconnaissance
enemies than by
flights
its
could
defenders?
photograph them.
It does not
About
happen because the
250
enemy
dummy
is more
landing
clever.
craft,
It
big
happens
bobs
because
and wet
the enemy
bobs,
is
were
more
deployed
willing to
across
look.
southeast
The
English
Allies looked at
harbours
the
from
Atlantic
Folkestone
Wall
to
from
the
every
Thames and
angle
the
they
Suffolk
could reach.
rivers.
They sent
Constant,
swimmers.
deliberately
They sent
careless radio
photographers.
traffic was
They sent
generated by
painters with
signal
fake
companies,
wallpaper samples.
sending
They
messages
asked
between
their own
units that
civilians
did
for
not
old
exist.
holiday
The
snapshots.
story being
They
told was
built
the
a single
same in every
picture
channel.
and they kept updating it.
The real
The
invasion
Germans
would come at the
meanwhile
Pas
built
de
the thing
Calais,
itself,
the
but
shortest
they did
crossing
not build a
point.
culture that could see
Whatever
it whole.
happened
By
anywhere
the
else
time
would be a
Rundstedt
feint.
admitted the truth in
The
a quiet
Germans
British
believed it.
interrogation room
They believed
in
it because they
1945,
wanted to
the
believe
truth
it,
had been visible
because the
for
Pas
2
de
years
Calais
to
made
anyone with
tactical
a bigot
sense,
clearance
and because
a
the
desk
source
lamp.
of the most detailed
Rundstedt himself
confirmation
is
was
a
a
more
Spanish British national named Juan Pujol Garcia, codename Garbo,
He was a Prussian
who was on the
aristocrat
British
who had
payroll
served 3
and was
Kaisers
feeding Berlin
and
a
a Führer.
steady diet
He
of
had
false
distrusted Hitler
reports
from the
through
beginning
27
and served him
imaginary
anyway.
sub-agents
He
he had
testified
invented
at
out of his own
Nuremberg about
head.
subjects he should have known
Rundstedt,
nothing
in
about,
meetings with
and tried to
Keitel,
claim
cited
unconvincingly
Garbo's
that he had
reports
not.
by name.
After his interrogation
So did
period,
Hitler.
he was held
The
in
German
British
15th
custody
Army,
in Germany,
with as many as
pending
19
possible
divisions,
war crimes
sat in the
charges.
Pas de
He
Calais
was
sector
charged on
before,
January
during,
1st,
and for weeks
1949,
after the actual
declared
landings in
medically
Normandy,
unfit to stand
waiting for
trial
an
in May,
invasion that would
and
never
formally
come.
released later
When it
that same
came,
month.
on June
He moved
6th,
to Hanover
the
with
men
his
on the
wife
wall
Bea.
in Normandy
She
met
suffered
an
a stroke
enemy
in
who already
January
knew the ground.
1952
The
and died
American
in
Rangers
October.
at Pointe du
Rundstedt
Hoc
himself
climbed
died
cliffs
on
at the right
February
place because
24th,
aerial photographs had
1953.
been studied for
Old
months.
comrades,
The British
including General
landings at
G.A.
Sword and
Blumreth,
Gold went
raised
in
money
along
in his last
corridors that
years
had
to
been
pay
mapped
for
by
nursing
resistance
care.
agents
He was
and by the
77.
swimmers from
What
the
he left
X-20
behind
and
beyond the
X-23.
campaigns and the
Even when the
captured
German
photographs
defense
was a
was
single
ferocious,
sentence.
as it
The
was at
enemy had
Omaha,
probably known
the
more
failures
about
of the
Atlantic
assault were
Wall than the
tactical
men who
rather
built
than
it.
strategic.
He said it in private.
The Allies
said
were
it
not
in
surprised by
interrogation.
what they found.
He said it more than
They
once
had
to
seen
more
most
than
of it
one
already.
interrogator in
Almost a
slightly
year
different
later,
words across
the war in Europe
1945
ended.
and 1946.
Rundstedt was captured
It
at
was not
Bad
a slip.
Tölz in
It was
Bavaria
by
on
the
May
end
1,
his settled view.
1945,
Most of the people who
by men
proved
of the
him right
United
are
States
not in the
36th
textbooks.
Infantry Division
Logan Scott
under
Bowen
Major
survived
General
the
John
war
E.
and lived a long
Dahlquist.
life.
He was
Occasionally
69
giving
years
talks
old,
about
and they had a
postal
single
health to small
intelligent covering
audiences
from
who had
Huck, a
never
single
heard of
set
it.
of maps.
Bruce
He suffered
Ogden
a single
Smith
deception
continued in the
plan.
Royal Marines.
They had time,
Andre
and they had
Dwavin,
something the
Colonel
Germans had
Pacey,
no equivalent
returned
of,
to a quiet
which was a flood of
civilian life
information
in
from
post-war
inside the wall
France.
itself,
Marcel
smuggled
Gerard
out by
kept the
men and women
surviving
who had
members of his
decided,
network in touch
individually,
through a small
that the
annual
wall had to
reunion
fall.
for decades.
While the wall was being
Renee
mapped,
Duchess,
a second
the Cajun
Allied
house
operation
painter
was
who walked out of
underway,
an
designed not to
organization-taught
find
office
German
with a roll
positions
of
but to make
fortification
Hitler
plans
stare at the
hidden
wrong
behind a
ones.
mirror died
It was called
in April
Operation Bodyguard,
1948
and
at
within
45
it,
years
Operation
old.
Fortitude
His health broken
South.
by the years of stress
Run from
and
offices in
clandestine
southern
work.
England,
A street in
Fortitude
Caen
South
near the Rue
created on
Colonel
paper
Remy
an
in the
entire
district
fictional
around the
army
Memorial
group,
Pour La
the first
is
United
now
States
named
Army
after him.
group.
His
11
wife
divisions
Odette,
and
who had been deported in his
150,000
place,
imaginary men,
came home
was
and
supposedly
outlived him by
commanded by
more than
General
half a
George
century.
Patton,
At
who at that
Medmenham,
point was
more
the
than
German
1,000
Army's
men
most
and
feared
women had
American
passed
officer.
through the
The
photographic
Phantom Army was
interpretation
given
huts during
encampments
the
in
war.
Kent and
The
Essex.
vast majority of the
Inflatable
interpreters
rubber
were women.
tanks were placed
Their
in
names
fields
appear,
where German
they appear at
reconnaissance
all,
flights could
on a single
photograph them.
bronze plaque at
About
Danesfield
250
House.
dummy
They had
landing
signed the
craft,
Official
Big
Secrets
Bobs
Act,
and Wet
and the
Bobs,
act did
were
not
deployed
expire
across
because the war
southeast
did.
English harbours
Some of
from
them lived
Folkestone
into the
to the Thames and the
1990s,
Suffolk
took their
rivers.
grandchildren to
Constant,
Sunday
deliberately
lunch, and
careless
died
radio
without their
traffic was
families
generated
ever
by
quite
signal
knowing what they
companies,
had done in
sending
their 20s.
messages between
Across
units
France,
that did not
very
exist.
large
The
sections
story
of the
being
Seigneurie
told
and
was the same
Confrérie
in
Notre
every
Dame
channel.
networks were destroyed by
The
the
real
Gestapo
invasion
before
would
the
come
war
at the
ended.
Pas de Calais,
The dead include
the shortest
fishermen from
crossing
Normandy
point.
ports whose names
Whatever
appear
happened
in
anywhere
dusty
else would be a
municipal
feint.
registries and
The
nowhere
Germans
else.
believed it.
The Atlantic
They believed
Wall,
it because
the
they
thing they
wanted
all
to believe
worked
it,
against,
because
still
the Pas de
stands in
Calais made
fragments along the
tactical
coasts
sense,
where they fought it.
and because the
Some has
source of the
fallen
most
into the sea.
detailed
Some has
confirmation
been
was a
swallowed by
Spanish
dunes.
national named
Some
Juan
is
Pujol
preserved as
Garcia,
memorial,
codename
especially
Garbo,
at the top
who was on the
battery
British
near Cap
payroll
Greens
and
and
was
at
feeding
Longsuir in
Berlin a
Normandy,
steady
where
diet of
4
false
casemates
reports
and
through
the original
27
guns can still be
imaginary
seen.
sub-agents
The
he had
bunkers are quiet
invented out
now.
of his own head.
School buses pull up.
Rundstedt, in
Children
meetings
walk
with
through the
Keitel,
casemates and look
cited
out through the
Garbo's
firing
reports by
slits at the
name.
gray water of the channel.
So did Hitler.
The same water
The
that on
German
the morning
15th
of June
Army,
6,
with as many as 19
1944 was
divisions,
suddenly
sat in the
full of
Pas de
ships.
Calais sector
The story
before,
that began in a
during,
small
and for
office at
weeks
Wilton
after the
Park
actual
ends in the same
landings in
place it
Normandy,
began, with
waiting
an
for
old
an
field
invasion that
marshal
would never
and a
come.
British
When it
interrogator
came,
and a
on
quiet,
June
brutal
6th,
sentence.
the men on the wall
Rundstedt
in
knew
Normandy
even
met an
before the
enemy who
invasion
already
came that he
knew the
was looking at
ground.
a
The
fortification
American
his
Rangers
enemy
at
had
Pointe du
already
Hoc
drawn in
climbed
colored
cliffs at the
ink
right
on a
place
map
because
kept in
aerial
a steel
photographs had
cabinet
been
in
studied for
St.
months.
James's Square.
The British
He could not
landings
say it
at
out loud
Sword
while
and
Hitler
Gold
was
went
alive.
in along
He said it it
corridors
later
that had
when he
been
had
mapped
nothing
by
left to
resistance
lose.
agents
The
and by
enemy
the
had
swimmers
probably
from the
known more about
X-20
the
and
wall than the men who
X-23.
built it.
Even when
He
the
was not
German
bitter when he
defense was
said it.
ferocious,
By the
as it
accounts of
was
the
at
men who
Omaha,
heard him,
the
he was
failures of the
simply
assault
tired.
were
He had
tactical
been a
rather than
soldier for 52
strategic.
years. He
The
had seen
Allies were
3
not
German
surprised by
states
what they
rise and
found.
fall. He
They
had
had
spent
seen
the
most of
last
it
of those
already.
years in command
Almost
of
a
a wall
year
he did
later,
not
the
believe
war
in
in
against
Europe
an
ended.
enemy who could see what he
Rundstedt
could
was
not.
captured at Bad
He admitted
Tolls in
it because in
Bavaria
the
on May
small, clean
1,
room in Buckinghamshire,
1945,
where the war
by
had
men of the
finally
United
ended for
States
him,
36th
there was no
Infantry
longer any
Division
reason
under
not
Major
to.
General
Thank
John
you for
E.
staying with this one.
Dahlquist.
If your
He was
father,
69
your
years old
grandfather,
and in
or
poor
anyone
health,
in your family worked
recovering
on the
from heart
Allied
trouble.
side of what I have just
He suffered
described, in the photographic units, in the combined operations parties, in the engineering battalions, in the resistance, or in any of the quieter offices behind the maps, I would be glad to read what you remember in the comments, the unit, the year, a single specific detail. That is what these uploads are for. The next investigation in this series goes to a different stretch of the same wall, and to the men who were ordered to hold a section of it that nobody, not even their own commanders, expected them to hold for him.